Well, good morning, good afternoon, folks. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are going to go ahead and get started. You may have just heard we will be recording this session. So if you would like, you can turn your videos on, but if you're more comfortable, definitely feel free to leave them off. Yeah, thank you again for joining us. I would love to welcome Haley Crim from NOAA's climate program. I'll be turning it over to Haley in just a minute, but do want to share a few things before we kick things off. Today's session is just one of 9 virtual workshop series that Climate Generations Education Program is putting on this year to really support the best practices of climate change communication and education and create opportunities for you all to connect with a professional community of climate change leaders and educators. Before Climate Generation does any type of workshop, we do a land acknowledgement. And we do this so that one of the effects of genocide and colonization is that it can be really easy to forget that we are still occupying land and that Indigenous individuals and communities are still alive and leading change in our world. We recognize the tremendous resilience and innovative climate solutions that are created by these communities, and we seek to raise up their voices in climate change education. Climate Generation is proud of the incredible diversity of our country, and we know that our vision for an equitable future can only be achieved when people work together, bridging experience and expertise from across the globe. If you're comfortable, we'd love for you to share in the chat who you are, where you're joining from, and what Indigenous lands you are on. So Climate Generation is a climate change education nonprofit based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. We are on a national scale, and our mission is to ignite and sustain the ability of educators, youth, and communities to act on the systems that perpetuate the climate crisis. And we do this through 3 overarching visions, which is to overcome climate and science disinformation, to really center anti-racism and systemic equity, and really personalize and localize climate change action. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Haley. Thank you much for joining us today, Haley. And I will be monitoring the chat if folks have questions.
All right. Hi, everyone. It's awesome to see you all. And I'm setting up the screen share, which will hopefully work. I can introduce myself real quick. So I'm Haley Crim from the NOAA Climate Program Office. I'm the Climate Engagement and Capacity Building Coordinator. So I do a lot of workforce development, teaching, climate communication, all of that good stuff. And if you've been to previous ones of these or previous Teach Climate Network events, you may have also met Amber Liggett and Frank Neopold and maybe other people from the office. So we love working with Climate Generation and the Teach Climate Network. So super excited to be here. And yeah, so what I'm going to talk about real quick and what we'll talk about together is how to talk about climate in the classroom and also in your community, and how to build bridges and make sure the whole community is being educated on not just climate science, but also action and justice and ways to participate. So that's a real quick introduction, and we'll get into it. Part of what makes this interactive is we're going to try Menti. It'll be a mix of slides and participatory questions and polls and things where everyone can see what the rest of the room is thinking. This has worked really well in the past. We use it for public engagement a lot, which is kind of a cool way to get a lot of feedback at once. And it just lets you see what everyone else is kind of thinking. It's all anonymous too, so don't worry about that. Feel free to put your thoughts in whatever form they come in. So once you're in there, just hit the thumbs up button so we can see how many people are there. There's 54 people on the Zoom. That's awesome. And also, if you get kicked off or you want to join later, there will be the go to Menti, enter the code at the top of the screen. So you can always come back. All right, we've got 18 people, no worries. You can also just come off mute and say stuff if you want. And feel free to interrupt me if you ever have a question. So just to test the Menti, it's a little bit hard if you're doing it on your phone. It's easier if you're on your browser, but just click generally in the area that you're calling from. Awesome, we've got some Canada, some good US. Is there anyone not from North America? Oh, yes, Brazil or Argentina, maybe, Uruguay. Cool, lots of responses. This is the first time I've done this type of question, so it's exciting to see it work. Awesome, lots of Northeast. Cool. This is just a demonstration, so we'll move on and keep sharing in the chat if you're sharing there. So now you can choose multiple choice. How would you describe yourself in this context? Like, obviously, there are a lot of different identities everyone holds, but in this meeting today, we have no teachers. 4 teachers, okay. Awesome. I feel like everyone's a community member, right? It's a lot of something else's. You can share in the chat also if you want to add, what other job types or identities you're bringing to this meeting. Cool. Got some strong response there. Awesome. So that's one part of setting the stage. The other part of setting the stage is a little bit of the sad stuff, which I'm sure isn't a surprise to anyone, but where are we at globally and why is climate literacy important? Globally, first challenge is that the workforce that currently exists isn't aligned to the economic and social transitions that we need. That's very clear. We're not just talking about wind turbine installers, but every job is a climate job is the usual refrain, and it's people don't have the understanding or the capacity or the training to be implementing that at the moment broadly. There's some industries and places that are doing it really well, which is exciting. But this is a key issue in climate literacy. So secondly, education systems currently aren't preparing communities and the workforce in a way that meets the scale of the transition. Especially in the US, we see really wildly varying education and teaching on climate. Again, this is definitely not a surprise, from some places that cannot talk about it to places that are doing excellent, field leading work, sometimes even in the same school district or in the same state. So getting that sort of education system level focus on climate is really important. And then lastly, people broadly don't have and don't know how to use information to make informed decisions about climate, whether that's where to live, what type of heating apparatus to replace your old boiler with, all of that kind of stuff, down to how much you should fly or where you should travel to, what career you should do, how you should make investment decisions. These are all climate literacy questions fundamentally. So I've been talking about it a little bit, but what actually is climate literacy? And I want to ask you. You should have a box open on your screen. You can also just come off mute or type it in the chat. When we're talking about climate literacy, just saying the word, what does that mean? Is there anything that you use as a definition? Is it something you've never heard of? Awesome, here we go. Sometimes it takes a second for responses to load. Depends, that's super important. Knowledge and understanding, impacts the health of our climate, what humans can do. Yeah, lots of understanding, mitigation and resilience. Climate action is super important. Environmental justice and anti-racist work is essential. Feeling knowledgeable and comfortable talking about it and how to communicate effectively. Informed and inspired. I don't even need to give the rest of this talk. You guys already know everything, what we're talking about. This is awesome. Yeah, climate change is caused by fossil fuels. Scientific, historical, and social mechanisms. So it's not just science. That's super important of both climate and social justice impacts. Oh, this is really interesting. Having the capacity to support ecologically sound, economically prosperous, and equitable communities in the moment and in the future, and do so with the understanding of how we impact the climate and vice versa. That I want to just take and put it in our documents, because that gets at both the understanding, it gets at the justice, it gets at the economic, and it also gets at the capacity building part, which of course I care a lot about as the capacity building coordinator. Awesome. Is there anything else that hasn't been put up here that anyone would like to share? Informed consent, I see in the chat. Great. So just to summarize what you all know already, how we're defining climate literacy is the ability to understand, communicate, and make informed decisions about how to address climate change and implement solutions. On the right is a picture of the old cover of the Climate Literacy Guide. And I say old because we are updating it. It hasn't been updated since 2009. The first version came out in 2008, so that's a really quick turnaround, and then we left it for 14 years. And the new version should be coming out very soon, and I'll talk about that at the end of the presentation. But just if you're wondering why that's there, it's a little hint that we're working on this again and we're actively thinking about it. And why we're doing that is because climate literacy is super important to getting, addressing the climate crisis in general and to fixing a lot of, or addressing a lot of social problems that we see in the US and around the world. So why do we need climate literacy? Because it helps people talk to each other. Fundamentally, groups of people who understand the causes, effects, and implications of climate change, including the justice implications, are better able to discuss, assess evidence, and take well-informed actions that meet their community's needs. So not trying to enforce anything from any level, but helping people really critically think and figure out and have the information to make the decisions that are best for them. So this is not, we're not just saying this, it is in the newest IPCC report that improving climate literacy promotes enhanced societal responses, behavior change, and in the end, reductions in emissions. And that's what we all care about, right? It also plays into building community, reducing climate anxiety, and can be an important part of addressing past harms and environmental injustices. Okay. So a quick sneak peek of our 2024 Essential Principles of Climate Knowledge is what we're kind of draft title at the moment. I can't share the exact language because it's actually being approved right now, hopefully for public review, but the principles that we care about this time are climate processes, causes of climate change, mainly fossil fuels, and they are explicitly mentioned, impacts of climate change in a variety of ways, what we can expect, mitigation strategies, necessity, adaptation strategies, and necessity, equity considerations of all different types. And then the last one is it's not too late, addressing anxiety, the need for action, that everyone can get involved. These are, the 7 categories of things that we as 30-ish agencies of the US government say is really important to know about climate. If you're familiar with the 2009 guide, this looks pretty different. I think the 2009 guide had 2 or 3 topics that focused on action or, resilience, mitigation, response to climate change, and the rest was climate science. And since then, what we've realized is in order to care about it and in order to act, you don't actually need to know the fundamentals of the science, which, speaking to a room of teachers, you're probably aware of. It's definitely important, but it's not necessary for action. And what is more important, especially in this day and age where people really do know about climate, is, it's not too late. Building hope, showing people how they can get involved, and making sure that equity and justice is in every piece of that. So that is how we're defining what people should know about climate to be considered climate literate. So with that in mind, how do you feel about your school or organization, museum, zoo, wherever you're working at? Do you think you're currently covering climate literacy? And there's a bunch of different options there, because a lot of people we talk to say that yes, but only the science part. Awesome, working on it. That's what I want to hear. And no shame at all in saying we can't. I know there's like political and social pressure around this that is really, a huge force in the landscape of climate teaching. Cool, okay. Lots of people are doing some, which is great. And lots of people are doing all, which is amazing. Just give it a minute or so. Cool. And for people who have joined in the last 10 minutes or so, we're using Menti, and you can go, it's in the chat. Perfect. Seth just put it in the chat. Or it's also at the top of the screen. You can use it on your browser or your phone, and you respond to these questions, or just come off mute or put it in the chat at any time. Great. So we've got a lot of work and interest, which is awesome. And I feel like this, no matter who we're talking to, workforce development organizations, schools, journalists, and media organizations, this is a pretty similar distribution. Lots of people are starting to work on it or do part of it, but there's huge interest in moving towards, making sure it's that full story of how is this happening, why is this happening, who's it impacting, and what can we do about it. So that's super encouraging. This is an interesting type of question that I hope works. It's another new one. How would you rank your community? However you define that. It could be, your church community. It could be just the town where you live, the groups that you talk to, people you're involved with. And it's a scale of 1 to 10. Awesome. Looks like waves or like a shark fin or something. Very NOAA. And I see a comment in the chat, not sure I agree with it not being necessary to know about the science. We'd have to talk about what science encompasses to know if you're making a difference. That is a really good point. And I'm not saying it's not important. I think I did actually say that, but I didn't mean that it's not important to know the science, but that so many organizations have, when they teach climate, focus on the science, when what we're realizing through different psychology and social science research is that what actually moves action is more the impacts and hope and response piece of it. So if you, this should be a part of our conversation later, but I just wanted to clarify that because I think I literally did say that and I didn't mean it. Yeah, I'm also kind of interested that only 2 people think it's about, I think that's 6 probably. Oh, 3. Most people are either really climate literate or medium. Great. Yeah, that's also important in the chat. Different communities that you're a part of will look very different probably on this. Well, awesome. We can look at some polling results to see broadly what's the state of climate literacy. And this is always interesting to me. Every time I look these graphs up, and maps, I get surprised. So A good news on climate literacy, which you might be seeing in your own work, is that we are far past the question of, is it happening? That sort of denier frame is pretty much gone globally. It's still there. There's a loud minority, but if you look at like representative samples and polls, there's really no disagreement on, is climate change happening? So that is a part we can move past. It's now time to talk about the solutions. When we talk about that, it's really strongly varies around the world and within the US whether people think climate change is personally important to them. And that is the piece that we find helps people take action. It helps people care about learning more, and really motivates people to work on it. So is it personally important? Varies strongly depending on where you are, including the global south tends to feel like it's more important. And if you look at other graphs in this series, which is from the Yale program on climate communication, there's some really interesting bifurcation in how people perceive being personally harmed by it versus it harming other people. So it's just something to think about, especially if you're doing work internationally or working with different communities that come from different places. The variety of ways that people interact with and perceive climate change varies strongly, and it has a lot to do with political and geopolitical issues. So in the US, 40 to 50% of people say that they actually personally care about climate change, which is interesting, and that I think is the challenge of climate literacy. But way more people, on the order of, I think it was 60 to 70% of people in the US do worry about it. They're either very or somewhat worried about climate change, and so is every other country around the world. The majority of people are worried about climate change. So that is another both entry point and potential hurdle in teaching climate change is the anxiety. So it can either lead to action or it can lead to paralysis. So that's something to be aware of. You can look at these results nationally by the county or congressional district level, which is really cool on the Yale website. So this is just a screenshot of the percentage of adults who talk about global warming. So if any of those things surprised you, that there's wide global agreement on climate change is happening and that they're worried about it, it could be because in the US, people don't talk about climate change at all. 36% of people said they talk about it at least occasionally, which is another central part of the issue that we're dealing with when we're talking about climate literacy. So, of course, as Catherine Hayhoe says, the most important thing you can do to fight climate change is talk about it. So the good news is people support education institutions and schools talking about it. This also was surprising to me when I looked it up, that there's no county in the country that doesn't have a majority of people that believe schools should be doing more than they're currently doing to teach about climate change. So if you ever feel lost or alone, I know that happens to me sometimes, in talking about climate, everyone supports you pretty much. There's huge agreement that it is important for schools in particular to talk about climate change. So how do we actually do that? And how do we do that in communities? As we saw earlier in the poll of this room, this is happening at all scales in all different kinds of ways. So from the intergovernmental and international, talking about like UNESCO, UNFCCC, to coordination between NGOs and academia. In the country, it's happening through national networks and coalitions like this, or like ASTC, for example, or the Coalition of State Science Supervisors, CS cubed, I can't remember what it stands for, something like that. It's happening at the national government, obviously. I work for a federal government agency. At the industry scale, it's happening in professional societies, it's happening at conferences, and then in communities, local governments a lot of the time are leading on this, and local organizations are either partners or pushing the local governments further. So there's a lot of work happening. What we see is that it's not often coordinated. So that's what we're going to talk about real quick. So first of all, do you work with any other organizations when you're talking about climate and trying to teach about it in your work? And if so, what type of organizations are they? We can put the name if it's something that people would recognize. Do you work with local universities, extension programs, workforce development groups? Trying to think of other examples that we've seen. News stations is an interesting one. The city, totally. Oh, Fish and Wildlife, yeah. Federal agencies. Great. There's so many different things. Yeah, lots of nonprofits, tribal organizations, that's important. The port, that's interesting.
I had an interesting conversation once at a conference where they were talking about trying to communicate with farmers and the local organization advocating for climate, and it was just the vocabulary, the lack of communication between the two organizations, and the farmers just not understanding the importance of the riparian buffers, and just feeling like they're being threatened. And I think that's part of it too. So it's misunderstanding.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's such an important part of, one, why we're trying to update Climate Literacy Guide, but also why this like community aspect of teaching is so important, I think, is to figure out how we can create shared language. And it doesn't have to be the same everywhere, but locally or in an industry or working on some problem, people have to be able to break those silos and talk to each other. So yeah, that's just so important. And I've run into that personally too. Wow, we're getting so many different things. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
I was just saying, just yeah, like meeting people where they are and trying to see things from their perspective, and like the only way to really make real change is to try to empathize and figure out, why are they resisting this? What is it that is they feel like? What are they feeling threatened by? Because sometimes it is a misunderstanding, and it's an easy fix if you can use the same language. It's all about using language, meeting people where they're at.
Totally. And one of the common questions that our office gets related to that is like, should I be talking about climate change if I know it's unpopular? And that's one of those things that, at least there are differing opinions on this, but I feel like if it helps you to talk about the economic impacts or the agricultural impacts or whatever who you're talking to cares about, there's so many different ways to get at these issues. Like, you don't necessarily have to talk about climate change. You can talk about, anything. It's finding that common ground, exactly like you said. Cool. We have a ton of responses, 90 responses on here. People love NASA, NOAA. Yeah, state level groups, coastal communities, youth groups, faith-based organizations, public schools, regional groups. This is amazing. So again, you've predicted my next question, which is, if you're not working with any of these groups, or if you're thinking about who you might want to reach out to, or you want to do some more community-based work, we've kind of looked at, and this comes from the UNFCCC actually, the important sectors that work on climate literacy. So training and workforce development, communication, which could be media, entertainment, businesses, even people who use or control access to information, like universities, colleges, federal and state agencies, but also community groups. And data sovereignty is a really important part of that conversation. Public engagement groups like youth groups, faith communities, local government is fundamentally an engagement group. And then also things that coordinate. It's important to have backbone organizations in this, like Climate Generation. So NGOs, community groups, local government, they can all play this role. So when we're looking at this, and if we go into certain towns or cities who are working on their, how to develop a climate action plan, or how to figure out what to actually prioritize and work on, it's we suggest leveraging existing resources. Like this work, as we've all just shared, is going on in so many different ways and so many different regionally and locally appropriate organizations and institutions that you'll move faster on this if you just reach out to them and connect rather than trying to start a new thing a lot of the time. So this, for example, is a map of Orlando with some of the groups that are working on climate change pulled out. We just did this from Google. Like we weren't actually in Orlando or anything. It would be much easier to do this for your own community where you live. But for example, you could have a really interesting climate literacy group or whatever you want to call it that works to educate the whole community from the Science Center to Universal Orlando Resort to programs in the schools and universities, university supplied data informing the whole process, and also making sure that this is covered and talked about appropriately in the local news. So any city has all of these things. So figuring out what works for you, where gaps are, who needs to be reached, and how you can reach them is really important, and it's easier to do. And there's more help out there than you would think, is what we find when we look at community resources. So if your community if you don't know what's going on, a lot of the times there are things that's going on, but as we said, people aren't talking about it. So things aren't connected. So some ways to start these conversations. There are a wide variety of ways to engage communities on this in a way that's depolarized. It's not, controversial or anything, from games and hosting, tabletop games or games for your school. There are a variety from, ones for K-12 to whole community level planning games, which are really fun, that teach people about civic and local engagement as well as climate change. You can host or get involved with a community science project. So I just put some examples up there of climate-related community science projects that could be interesting. Also, if you're in a K-12 school, as a resource for your class potentially. There are toolkits out there to organize community climate summits, which has been a really effective way of getting people involved and caring about their local climate action. And then, of course, if your local government is doing or updating or working on their climate action plan, there's always ways to get involved there, and more local involvement is always good. I'm just taking a second to look in the chat because there's a ton more comments in there since I last looked. Cool. We can get to some of these questions in a second. I'm almost done before we get to our discussion, but I wanted to just share some current and upcoming resources of things that might be helpful if you're interested in community climate literacy work. So of existing resources, of course, the Clean Network, which I bet you've all heard of a bunch of times, has a lot of guides, curricula, and resources for teaching and talking about climate in all different grade levels and audiences. The Yale program on climate communication is where all of those graphs and maps came from. They do communication and attitude research, including beliefs, like do people care about or know about climate change, and also specific things people are interested in and policy support. So you can tailor outreach and things more closely to your audience. If you look at that, that might be interesting. And then the last one, these are just a couple examples that I pulled out that we work with, is the ASTC Seeding Action Group, which just started last year. And they are building coalitions of education organizations, primarily informal education institutions, to work on hope and planetary health and building these type of community-based coalitions. So that's an actual group with resources and stuff that they're putting together. If you work in an informal institution, that could be really helpful. So just wanted to shout them out. There's a ton of work being done in this area right now. So some upcoming resources, these are all coming out this year at some point. As I mentioned, the Climate Literacy Guide, which will be coming out, we're hoping, cross your fingers, in the May timeframe. And it will be out for public review cross your fingers, in March. So we really want to hear your feedback. And if we miss the mark, you can also just say that right in this chat, but you'll be able to read the specific language and everything in March. And we'll figure out how to get the form to submit your comments, is what I was looking for, out to all of you, so that we would love to hear your feedback. Another similar effort that kind of plays along with the climate literacy guide is the Educating for Just Climate Action guidelines, which the North American Association of Environmental Education is putting out again sometime this year. That is more on the action kind of climate justice side, and it plays really well and builds off of the climate literacy guide. So that will be coming out. Both of these are not just useful for K-12, by the way, also. They're intended to be broadly applicable. Then the steps to accelerating community climate action is what that map of Orlando was for, and that is a toolkit of how you might go around building these coalitions. That'll be coming out probably later in the summer and the fall of this year. And the last thing is the US Climate Training Database. So if you work with workforce development, or there's a need for some type of new job or skill, or even just, more adult, late high school level climate knowledge in your community, we're putting together a searchable database of hundreds of climate trainings that are publicly accessible that you will be able to look through and just go and use if they're useful. So that is the end of my official slides. I know there's been a ton of discussion talk in the chat, so I'd love to open it up if anyone has any questions or anything they want to keep talking about. And my email is on the slide, so I would love to keep talking about this too. If you have thoughts or want to share anything in the future, feel free to send me an email. Thank you all so much. And yeah, if anyone has questions, you can either raise your hand or just come off mute. I'll stop sharing so we can see each other. Nothing at all. Well, it's been a very active chat, so I'm going to look through the chat for a second. Oh yeah, Colleen.
Oh, go ahead, Colleen.
Yeah, well, there's this question in the chat. I didn't ask it, but I was curious about your response to it. Is how important is state level support for cohesive, centralized climate education and climate action?
That is a super important question, and I think it totally varies. So given that climate education in general is so decentralized, if you're in a state that is favorable to it, it could be really helpful in accelerating and making the connections for funding, for, making curricula. I actually don't know if that's true. Can states mandate curricula, right? Yeah. So mandating curricula, like they're doing in New Jersey and Maine, that can be super helpful. But if some states are unfavorable, and who knows when it will change or if it will change. So there have to also be ways to get around the need to have state funding or organization capacity. So I think it just really depends on the location. That's not a very definitive answer, but it can be very helpful, and it can also be, you can go around it. Aha, yes. Thank you for clarifying in the chat. You can recommend, states can recommend curricula, but they don't typically mandate it. Yeah, Corey.
I'm just curious if folks on the call think that the climate content that's covered in the next generation science standards is sufficient. I know there was a report card that came out to grade states on their climate education, and if a state had adopted next generation science standards, they automatically got a B+ on that report card. And I'm just curious to see what others think about that and whether they feel like that's enough for what we're facing for the future.
While people are thinking about that,
Yeah. So it
I'll
was
just, oh yeah.
actually my organization, NCSE, that helped with that report. And they found that the NGSS did a decent job in preparing students to know the content, but where they stopped, like the B plus, was that they didn't do a good job of preparing students to take action on it later, and talk about it like at the university level and beyond. So.
Yeah, I'll just add that the Next Generation Science Standards climate content was actually based on the 2009 Climate Literacy Guide. And it wasn't like the group who wrote that didn't put it forward for consideration. They found it somehow. So we're kind of hoping that happens again, or it can be updated with the new content that hopefully will lead better into careers, into university, into, figuring out what you want to do about climate change.
Hi, this is Isla from New Jersey. I'm wondering if you could recommend a game or an exercise to engage a community group.
Yeah, I'm gonna send out, hopefully Seth will help. I haven't talked about this, but I was thinking about making like a spreadsheet or a Google Doc or something with some examples of games and things. Because I think that's really fun and it has been a really good way to engage communities. There are a ton of games that are focused at facilitating community conversation. I would say probably more than are focused on like K-12 education. So yes, there are definitely examples of that, and I can put together a list of some of them.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, no problem.
Hi, I have a question. I represent a community from Ecuador. I can tell there are some partners here from South America. And talking about education, I was wondering if there is interest to develop tools of education with regards communities, coastal communities. That we're talking people here that they are not quite involved with the technical terms or specifications. So is there a tool with regards this approach to such communities? Because here in Ecuador, I want to share some of my personal experience. Here in Ecuador, we're working with a community that is actually working in marine aquaculture, but targeting in restorative aquaculture with regard to ocean acidification. So I was wondering if there's tools already developed in order to teach the importance, the main topics, the main descriptions, but focused on community, coastal communities. We're talking about women, men that are older. Sometimes they are younger, but they have no background with a superior education, And I was wondering if you all have contemplated these type of scenarios and developed such tools specifically designed to these communities.
Yeah, and anyone else who works on this, feel free to jump in. On the climate training side, that's one thing that we've really found is a gap. Are those sort of entry level, very, easy to understand, almost like very accessible language climate trainings that are useful. It's not just like, this is the greenhouse effect, whatever. Like there are lots of YouTube videos that do that and that are great, but actually to facilitate climate conversations and community action, we haven't found a ton of those. So there's a lot of work being done, I know of, in the US government, but most of those that I'm aware of are all in English. If that is a problem, I really think there, at least of the ones that I know of, there's a huge gap in translation, which is a problem that we need to work on like as a field and also as the government. And if anyone else knows on, oh, here we go. There's some links in the chat that might be helpful for you. Yeah, lots of links. En-ROADS is awesome from MIT for climate games. The Climate Fresque is a good kind of introductory one. Yeah, I'm going to save the chat because I like all these resources. Oh, awesome. And Seth's doing the same. So we'll put that all in the document that goes out after this. Yeah, Douglas?
Hey everybody, thanks for this presentation. This is great to be around all these educators. So hi to everyone around the world. I just wanted to share, I work with Roots of Success, which is environmental literacy apprenticeship and pre-apprenticeship program. And so we have versions also all in Spanish. And try to kind of put it into a thing, but basically it's a 10 module, 60-hour course. That's the youngest we would probably go is high school as well as through adults. We've been around since 2009, and we actually have the first CTE environmental literacy instructor apprenticeship in the country. And the students go through the pre-apprenticeship job training component. So if anybody's looking for an environmental literacy curriculum that they want to plug into a high school or community-based organization, as well as prisons and jails or any carceral setting, I'd love to learn more about the work you're doing. So great to see everybody and all the work that you're doing. Thanks.
Yeah, people in the chat want to hear more about that. And so do I. That's so interesting.
Yeah, I'll put the website in the chat. I mean, I don't want to take up too much time, but I love connecting with environmental literacy instructors or educators or whatnot. So I'll put our website in the chat and then my email, and feel free to reach out. But yeah, I don't want to take up too much space. It's a really cool program. Our founder and executive director is a real visionary. So
Awesome. Yeah, I'll have to check that out. Cool. There's a question in the chat about from someone who works and lives in Chicago. Oh, and people are responding to it. Working with children in an after-school program, climate change can be scary to explain for children in kindergarten and first grade. How do we go about that without giving them that fear? That I will put on, out to everyone. I don't normally work with like really young kids, but I know that is something that we've been talking about as a gap also. And what exists in the government is like, we know these kids know about it. And if you're not helping to talk about it and frame it in a good way, what they're hearing is this like horrifying, you know, it's really scary. And it's not just for like kindergarten and first grade, but especially starting that young, there's just so little coverage that we have, at least. So if anyone else knows more about that. Oh, there's some good stuff happening in the chat, but feel free to unmute. This can be more of a conversation. Yeah, Yana. Sorry if I pronounced your name
It's
wrong.
okay. It's Jana. I don't want to take your whole conversation up, but I do specifically have a program and a curriculum that works with 3 to 6 year olds. So if anybody has any interest in that, that's exactly what we're doing, is trying to close that gap and set these children out with a foundation so that when they do come into later years in elementary and high school, it's not going to be foreign. It's not going to be scary. It's going to be part of their lifestyle. They're going to embrace it and be resilient. And we've really seen some great things happen with it in the children we've worked with. So if anybody has any question or curiosities about that, and I'm in New Jersey, but this can be anywhere, informal or formal education settings.
Yeah, that's awesome. It sounds like everyone in the chat wants to hear more about that. That's so cool.
I dropped a link in the chat earlier. It's called Earth Friends. So the link is in there somewhere.
Great, thank you. Awesome. There's another question in the chat. What are ideas to reach young adults to engage in climate work and reduce their anxiety about climate change? I'm opening this up again. Like, please. I'm not the expert on this, but Yeah.
I can answer from, so I'm actually an English teacher. I've been teaching English for like almost a little over a decade, and everyone always asks me like, why are you not a science teacher? But the thing is, you can access a lot of this through actual literacy, and it does reduce stress and anxiety just getting the kids outside, just going outside, like just getting a relationship with the environment. And if anyone, I wrote a book on how, if anyone works with English teachers, like how English teachers can in secondary curriculum, like 6 through 12, use nature-based learning. That'll help kind of address that question. Just let me know. I can drop it in the chat.
Yeah, please drop that in the chat. I also put in the Climate Mental Health Network, which does work with, I think mainly older kids and adults, but around climate anxiety, and they're awesome. They have a lot of different people. I also noticed Corrine, again, sorry if I said your name wrong, put in that Inner Development Goals framework, which I also love, which is a really important framework for looking at personal development with relation to sustainable development and community skill development of social skills and skills that lead to a better future. If you want to add anything to that. I actually talked to them this morning. I love the inner development goals. Oh, the existential toolkit for climate justice educators. That's super interesting. I will definitely be reading that when it comes out.
And there's probably overstimulation with all these resources. I saw someone drop like a doc where they're trying to put them all in one place. That's a great idea. We could just like try to consolidate, because I know sometimes I get lost in the weeds.
Yeah, totally. And I'll add the ones that were in the presentation, and we'll try to capture everything on here. And if you have more, we may as well put them out there. If anyone has things that they need resources to work on, are any of you working on something that you feel like someone else in the room could help with? This could be a good opportunity. Oh, guide for teachers in Tennessee. Awesome. Yeah, those local guides would be really helpful too.
I'm up here in Alaska. I'm Colleen Fisk, and I do focus on energy education. So it's really nice. I really like being able to start from a solution standpoint. I know there's a lot of research too in terms of starting from, talking about the solutions and not spending as much time on the climate, because the climate education piece necessarily, I mean, obviously it's important, but to think about that as the solution side of things. And, I get to talk about it just from the solution side, but from my work, that's a lot of my focus. And I find that it's really helpful. And even living in Alaska, very rural, I visit a lot of very rural, very red, live in a very rural red community. And yet I don't have any issues talking about climate change with people. And I think what I was seeing in the chat earlier, people are saying sometimes you just have to avoid those trigger words. Like I talk about clean energy, not green energy. I talk about conservation, not environmentalism, and so I just appreciated the other people putting that in the chat, and kind of curious if other people do energy education as well. How other people address that in terms of thinking about solutions in terms of starting that way, or how much you include that in your education.
Yes, I can say from the government side, there's an energy literacy guide that you're probably familiar with that goes along with the climate literacy guide. I'm just looking for the link, but I'll put it in the chat when I find it. Yeah, Sam?
I can chime in quick. Yeah, I'm on a team here in Michigan doing work around environmental justice in particular. We have an environmental justice curriculum we use, and that was one of the first things we heard feedback on was, well, we don't really want to be pushing any agendas or anything like that, which was really interesting to us because I think the curriculum we have developed is more about environmental health and just kind of around that. So that was just, don't have much feedback for you. We also do have a little energy equity lesson in it, but that was something that we had to deal with as well. It's just like kind of what language do we want to use, but also trying to like stay true to what the goal of the curriculum was. I think there's a lot of different words that maybe mean different things to different people, but I think for my team and the team I work with, we really try to like just stay true. Like we really want to teach about environmental justice and really particular learning about the community around in kids and how that impacts their health themselves and then their family's health, the community's health. So it is a big issue. I think that's kind of hard to go around. Mhm.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're getting a lot of thumbs up and stuff in the chat. Yeah, I totally agree with that. We, I think, have to wrap up right now, right? There's so many more things in the chat. I will try to type back. There's one question I just want to call people's attention to from Haley, who can't talk, or again, not sure how to say your name, but for experience with middle and high school career counseling, career shadows, and workforce development, which I have a lot of thoughts about. So I'll type in the chat, and if anyone else has resources, throw them in. We'll get them in the Google Doc, and I'll pass it back to Sean. Thank you all so much.
Well, thank you, everybody, and thank you so much, Haley. No worries. I really appreciate the great conversation that we've had. And as I mentioned, I will be working with Haley to go through all of those amazing resources and share links. And we'll also send a link to our next Teach Climate Network workshop in March, which is really about how to engage students and communities that maybe there is some pushback around climate change education. So really how to have those open conversations. Yeah, really appreciate that you're all here. And thanks again so much to Haley and NOAA for sharing that wide breadth of information. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you all. Have a good one.